How's it going, everybody? Back here for another tier list this week. We had probably the biggest weekend in Pioneer in a very long time. We had a PTQ on Friday on Magic Online. We had a challenge on Saturday, a challenge on Sunday. We had a SCG Con that had a team event with Pioneer in one of the 3 seats, and we also had a Pioneer 5K. So looking at all of those, we're looking at the top 16 of the SCG Con, the top 16 of the 5K, the top 16 of each challenge, and the top 16 of the PTQ. So we have about 80 results that we are looking at for this week's tier list. First off, I want to start by looking at the decks that fell out of the rankings this week. Sort of taking an idea from the college football rankings as teams fall out. Just want to let people know that these are decks that went from ranked last week to not showing up in any of the results that we're counting. First up, we have Red White Burn. We saw that fall out of favor, most likely due to the emergence of Monoraid Aggro continuing to be the linear aggro deck to fight the top decks, as well as decks like Winoda being able to easily handle that style of matchup. Next up, we saw Bant Spirits fall out, and while we had 2 other Spirits versions have finishes this week, neither one did super impressively, and Bant Spirits didn't show up at all. It did manage top 32, but we're not looking that far down the standings of the challenges. Next up, we have Jun's Sacrifice. This is another one of those decks that was lower in the rankings. It was a D tier last week, and it fell out, unsurprisingly. Not really any strong finishes this week. One of the big surprises, though, was Niv-to-Light, which was an A tier last week, didn't really show any results. I think a big part of that is the emergence of Lotus Field as the combo deck of choice for the format, as well as the fact that you no longer, I believe, have a good matchup into Blue-White Control, and your Phoenix and Winnow matchups are a little bit too close. Niv is a great meta deck to attack the decks trying to attack those decks, but if the meta is overwhelmingly the S tier decks from last week, you tend to be in a bad spot. So that was Burn as a B tier from last week, and Spirits C tier, Jund D tier, and Niv-to-Light A tier, all falling out without any results this week. Next up, we're just going to give a quick shout out, not going to put these up on the screen, but these are decks that had at least one result this weekend, that I think the one result was probably a stretch realistically. I don't think these are decks that you want to bring anywhere outside of like an F&M tier. Obviously, these decks can do well at local events, things like that. But for the competitive environment, I think these are skips, especially for this week. So in the F&M tier, we have Black-White Vampires, Red-Black Blood, Blue-White Spirits, and Mono-Black Aggro. Now, Mono-Black Aggro was D tier last week. I think that people are playing a lot more Mono-Black Aggro right now, but I think the intended goal was to target Blue-White Control, and I think due to March of the Otherworldly Light and the Wandering Emperor, you no longer even have a resilient matchup into Blue-White, meaning you are bad into all of the previous S tiers and Blue-White Control, which was the most represented deck in the top finishes this weekend. So now let's start with our normal tier list here, going from D to S. Once again, just giving you the overview of the tiers here. D tier, once again, these are decks that had enough of a strong presence this weekend to warrant some amount of consideration. I don't think they are decks you want to be playing. I think they can take some people by surprise, or they're 1 or 2 cards away or 1 or 2 pieces away in builds or in availability from moving into that range where I would believe they're more likely to be contenders. So first up, we have 4 colors Fires using Agent of Treachery, or the 5-color version using Agent of Treachery and Transmogrify. I think this deck continually shows up because of the top end possibilities of getting an early Transmogrify, stealing powerful permanents or lands, and just riding that to victory. I don't think this is a deck that is very well positioned, especially in a world where you have decks like Lotus Field, Blue-White Control, and Monoraid Aggro prowling around. But if we see a slowing down of the aggro decks with more mid-range, then Fires can start to pick off the mid-range decks, but you will still struggle against the hard control decks. And that is a new deck onto the tier list. This week, we're also going to highlight where decks were last week, what their movement looked like, and if they're new to the list. So again, this is D tier, and we have another new deck, and that's Blue-Red Control. This is sort of like taking, is it Phoenix? You strip away the Phoenixes, the reliance on the Delve spells to a degree, and you just really maximize your controlling cards and use Narset, Days Undoing, and Niv Mizzet Perrin to control the board and kill your opponent, having multiple ways to interact positively with Phoenix and Blue-White Control. And a lot of the aggro decks gives this a good amount of potential, but I don't think it actually is able to deal with the aggro decks effectively, especially since they're burn heavy right now. And I think you still have an incredibly close matchup with Phoenix, and the better pilots on Phoenix will still be able to maneuver the game in an unfavorable way for you. Next up, we have a new deck to the tier list, but an old contender, and that is Oros Feather. Obviously, since the Luris ban, we've been seeing Heroic pop up, but with Feather instead, sort of a harken back to its days in Standard. I think Feather is a good deck. I think it is slower and a little bit more clunky than the low to the ground version we saw with Luris. I don't think it is quite in a position to be challenging any of the top decks, but I think that like many of the decks in D tier, if things start to shift above it, it might be able to prey on some of these decks. Next up, we have the final deck of D tier, and that is Gruel Aggro, another new deck to the tier list. This is a deck that has been popping up a lot on Magic Online for the 5-0s. We've been seeing a lot of different builds, many different styles from Bushwhacker to leaning on Gallia to Warboss. The spots and the different pieces of this deck are all over the place. And I think as it refines, there's a better chance that it moves up the tier list. I think we need somebody to sort of isolate the right numbers, figure out what it looks like, and also consider the fact that you need a little bit better mana because you don't have fast lands. So your mana base is a little bit all over the place. I think you also struggle into Winoda, which is a big problem, but I think you do have a good matchup into some of the other high tier decks. So if Gruel Aggro consolidates into a more permanent build, I think there's a good chance it will move up the tier list. Next up, we move to the C tier, and here we're going to look at first Marty Griessfang. It's a new variant of the Esper Griessfang, Abzan Griessfang. These Griessfang decks continue to change. They sort of have the black-white base usually. This is more of a red-black base, splashing white. It's leveraging the blood package of Vampire Epicure and Blood Tithe Harvester, along with Fable of the Mirror Breaker to fuel the graveyard, have a good mid-game, and then use Griessfang to power out Parhellions. I think this is an interesting deck. I think it will have some challenges for sure, but I think the general basis of the blood decks, leveraging Kroxa, and then having Griessfang as a backup win condition is a very powerful engine. But again, we're still early enough in the development of this deck that the build will probably need to change. Next up, we have Mono Blue Spirits. This deck stays at C tier. I think it remains in the same position as last week. You're able to attack some of the spell-based combo decks and control decks, but you are still weak to a vast majority of the top tier decks. Next up, we have Mono Green Carn, which falls again down to C tier from B tier of last week. It has continually gone down from its A tier earlier in the season. I think the problem with Mono Green Carn right now is that you just have some problems dealing with Phoenix, Blue-White Control, and now with the addition of Lotus Field being a top deck in the format, you are just sort of getting squeezed by all the different angles, and you are a deck that has to sort of operate the same way every game. If you get to operate that way, you're very powerful. If your opponent can interact with you favorably, you sort of sputter out and die. So I think as people got more used to playing against this deck and were able to figure out the play patterns, you lose some percentage by not having an active sideboard and not having access to powerful enough hate in the sideboard like in, say, Modern. Next up, the final C tier deck, and that is 5-color Humans, remains at C tier for another week, though Humans did put up a good showing at the Team SCG, specifically coming in first in the hands of Aggro Master Max McBeady, and I believe 9th as well in the main event. Of the 80 results this weekend, Humans only had those two. So in the PTQ, the 2 challenges, and the 5K, not a single time did Humans show up in the top 16, nor in any of the challenges did the Humans deck even show up in the top 32. while humans put up a good performance in the hands of Max McVitie alongside Clay Spicklemore and Andrew Ellenbogen. Unfortunately, I think the team environment does make it a more questionable result as far as the quality of the deck involved, alongside the fact that a absolute master of aggro took the deck to a first place finish. Had it had any more results somewhere else, just any amount of evidence that outside of the hands of those top level players in a team style event that the deck performed at all this weekend, I think it could have moved up to B tier, but I think it's closer to moving to D tier than B tier right now, as we don't see the results living up to the very top result that Max put up this weekend. Next up, we have B tier. These are the decks that I think are very likely to be the upsets getting into the top 8 of these challenges. I would not be surprised at all to see them in the top 16. They are a full step below the S and A tier, which I think are your true contenders. But I think if your matchups line up correctly or you run into the right metagame, these are great upset picks. Both of these decks fall under the same color pair, and that is going to start with Red-Black Midrange returning to B tier from last week. Red-Black Midrange continues to pick on the creature decks of the format, especially as we see a diversification of the low-to-the-ground aggro decks. Before we saw Monoraid Aggro really pull ahead as the aggro deck of Pioneer right now, you got a lot of value out of attacking some of the less tuned builds. I think having access to cards like Graveyard Trespasser, Thoughtseize Fatal Push, Chandra, Torch of Defiance, and Sorin the Mirthless, all of these cards give you an avenue to attack both the aggressive decks and the slower decks. Where you are truly weakest is the fact that Lotus Field has had a resurgence, and that is the biggest thing holding Black-Red Midrange down from being A tier, in my opinion. Next up, we have Red-Black Oni Cult, which moves up from D tier last week, which was only D tier because we saw it as a proof of concept that the deck wasn't dead after the Lurrus ban, similar to Max McVitie. We saw it have a little bit of success this weekend. Obviously, it won one of the challenges, it top 16 another challenge, and it 5-0'd this week, but they were all in the hands of Jabberwocky. Another example of a top tier player potentially skewing the results by being the primary finisher in all of these instances. However, this was a deck that already proved its dominance in Lurrus, and I think now that we've seen Logan be able to crush these events, I would not be surprised to see a resurgence of this deck, and I think you are able to adequately fight through a lot of the top tier decks, especially Monoraid Aggro and Blue-White Control. Next up, we move to A tier. These are the decks that I would expect you need to be able to beat to make it into top 8. These are certainly contenders to make top 8, and if you told me either of these decks were going to win a challenge this weekend, I would not be surprised, as they have put up a ton of good results recently. That is Monoraid Aggro, which remains A tier, and Lotus Field, which remains A tier. So let's look at Monoraid Aggro first, putting up 9 results this past weekend out of the 80 results. Monoraid Aggro continues to be able to beat up on some of the slower decks in the format, especially getting under decks like Lotus Field and Blue-White Control. Where it will struggle is if the format moves to a more mid-range style or the fast starts out of Winoda. I also think that while the Monoraid Aggro decks are very well built, they are targeting a very specific metagame, and if you run into the wrong portion of the metagame, you will crash and burn. Lotus Field, on the other hand, won the PTQ on Friday, put up a handful of good results this weekend at 8 top finishes, and I think overall your ability to fight through Blue-White Control is an important part of why this deck continues to be A tier. We saw the PTQ winner drastically change some of the sideboard slots, adding a Second Thought Distortion, Sphinx of the Final Word. These cards that are nigh unbeatable for Control if they ever resolve, or if you can find them, giving you really good game in a mid to late game with a deck that already could combo well. The addition of Leer main makes it so that you're able to combo easier, even if you are a little bit constricted on resources. I think Lotus Field is very close to breaking into the S tier, and we are about a week away from seeing one of the S tier decks potentially go down to A tier, and Lotus Field moving up if they continue to show the results we've been seeing. Next up, we have the S tier decks. These are the decks that are your odds-on favorite to win any event this weekend. They are the decks you must respect if you are planning to play a big event this weekend, and honestly, they shouldn't be any surprise at this point. They have been the hallmarks of the format since weeks ago, ever since Luris had a bad week right before it was banned. These were the decks alongside Red Black Oni Anvil that were really tearing up the format, and that is starting with Blue White Control, which returns to S tier. It had a very bad weekend last weekend by its terms, but I think we moved it down to B tier a little too early. It came back with a force with 14 top finishes, including dominating the PTQ, putting up 6 of the top 16 slots, including half of the top 8. Now, the reason why I still think it didn't actually perform to the same degree we think it would with 14 finishes is that of the other 8 finishes it had, the majority of them were in the team event. I think that people came prepared on Saturday and Sunday for Blue White Control, and I think we will see Blue White Control potentially be attacked again this weekend, but it's hard to bet against Blue White Control. It is going to be a dominating force in the format, and I don't think that realistically will change unless the meta shifts aggressively towards decks like Lotus Field. Next up, we have Winoda. Again, a return to S tier for Winoda, putting up 11 top finishes. Truly had a rough Friday at the PTQ. Very few Winoda decks, only one top 16, but in the challenges and the 5K specifically, it came up clutch. I think when you look at the quality of the 5K versus the challenges and the PTQ, I think that Winoda is dangerously close to moving back to A tier. I think it is still very powerful. It's still able to be a top deck, but I think people are adjusting well. I think the presence of Red Black midrange, the presence of Monoraid Aggro being able to potentially fight through it, and I think the adjustments of Blue White Control into Phoenix are going to continue to keep Winoda in check. I think if any of the 3 S tier decks were going to fall next week, my bet would be on Winoda, but for now, still certainly an S tier. Finally, the perennial S tier, Blue Red Phoenix strikes again with 10 top finishes this weekend. It's hard to keep a good deck down. You know, again, a weak PTQ because of the presence of Blue White dominating that PTQ. Phoenix managed to still have half of its top finishes in the challenges. It won the challenge on the 19th in true Phoenix fashion. It is very hard to keep this deck down, even when people know to fight it. I think that until we see a major shakeup in the format, Blue Red Phoenix will continue to be S tier. It is the deck that I am unshaken in my belief will remain S tier until the next set, regardless of what else occurs. That is the tier list for this week. Appreciate everybody who checks out these tier lists. If you want to have access to the written version of this list, it comes out on Mondays on my Patreon for all patrons, even as low as $1. Please be sure to leave comments down below on what you think is too high, what you think is too low, and what decks you think are the secret sleepers of the format. Until next time. Hey there. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you've enjoyed this content on either Twitch or YouTube. If you did, please like or subscribe. If you didn't, be sure to leave a comment down below. I promise not to read it. Until next time.